to begin our journey through this course and developing some cultural competence, we need to begin with a basic definition and ask, what is culture? Culture, by definition, relates to the customs, practices, ways of living, worldview of a particular people or social group. So culture will involve behaviors that we think are appropriate to a particular situation. Culture will involve values that we hold and think that others ought to share. Culture will involve symbols that represent things that are important to us, and cultures often carry certain languages. Now, let's stop here and think about the Christian faith as a culture. There are certain behaviors that we think are important. Praying, for example, is a behavior that we believe Christians should do. Reading the Bible is a behavior we believe Christians should do. Values, we value compassion. We think that people should be compassionate. We value a certain moral kind of compass in our lives. We think people should have a certain level of morality. These are values. Symbols. You can think about the symbols. The chalice is a symbol that is meaningful to Christians, but not to others. The cross is a symbol that has meaning for Christians, but not necessarily for other cultures. Your own church may have symbols in the building that are meaningful to your congregation, but would not be even to other congregations. And finally, languages may not necessarily be the language of a people such as English, Spanish, Russian, Chinese. A language may actually be something like the Christian vocabulary that we use that those who are not part of the Christian faith wouldn't necessarily understand. There are words and languages that we use to communicate about our particular culture, including the Christian faith. Now, what is important to understand here is that we are taught these cultures, and the standards that we hold are learned. And so if we have learned various cultures in our own lives, then it's clear that we can learn about other cultures and the way they operate. And that's the goal here, is to increase our learning about a variety of cultures. It doesn't mean we necessarily agree with their behaviors and their values and so forth. But what it does mean is that we come to understand and see those differences and can be more accepting of who others are. And don't you think in our world today, and even in our church today, coming to that kind of deeper understanding would better reflect the way of Christ in the world? So let's think about Jesus for a moment. And all of you are familiar with Jesus. All of you, I imagine, love Jesus. And he is, in fact, the model for the way we are to live in the world. Everything about Jesus is telling us something about how we should live, what kind of people we should be. Now, there are cultural pieces of Jesus that he does not expect us to take on. Jesus was a Jew. He doesn't call us to be Jewish. He doesn't call us to live according to the law of Judaism. He doesn't say that you can't do that. And so we respect those who practice the Jewish faith as our brothers and sisters. But there are aspects of who he is that he wants us to understand and appreciate without necessarily becoming that. He was from Palestine. He was raised in the Middle East in a particular time in history, 2,000 years ago. It's a time and a place you and I can't inhabit. And he lived in a culture based upon where he was raised, where he grew up, and that was Nazareth, where he is from. There are particular cultural norms related to the particular places that we grow up in. And even if you're living in the same state, different cities and towns and countrysides have different kinds of norms. Now, those are things that tell us something about who Jesus is, that he had certain cultural understandings, certain cultural behaviors, values, etc. And yet, we know from the Gospels that he frequently challenged those kinds of cultural norms and standards. Anytime a culture was seen by Jesus as excluding people, he opposed it. He invited people in. He didn't let those cultural differences be barriers. Now think about this. In the ancient world, to have some kind of physical disability, some sort of disabling condition, was actually considered sinful. You couldn't touch someone who had some sort of skin disease. They had to be isolated. Someone was blind. Someone was deaf. They were not allowed to be part of the community because culturally they were unclean. They were sinful. And Jesus invites them in. There were all these barriers, all these norms that said they don't belong, and Jesus says that's not the case. In fact, we see times that Jesus is reaching across cultural boundaries. Obviously, the story of the Good Samaritan, an enemy of Israel, and Jesus is saying, no, look, there are good things in this culture. This is the one who stops to help. This is a value that's a good value. So remember, Jesus is constantly challenging these kinds of standards that we set up, such that when we think, gee, my culture is right, we need to stop and look at Jesus. And remember, my culture is one way of living before God, and maybe other ways are acceptable in the sight of God. It is important for each one of us to recognize that we don't live in a single culture, but we actually exist in multiple cultures and often don't really carry an awareness of the multiple cultures that we live in and move between. Certainly, our religion is a culture. Being a Christian is a culture, but within the Christian faith, there are a variety of cultures, and a local church is a cultural reality. I have come to see something at my own church, and that is when visitors come, they tend to notice our culture. We are a very friendly congregation, and not in that kind of false sincerity, but People can tell that we are genuinely friendly to one another and to those who come in the building. If you come to a church to be kind of anonymous and just be able to pop in and out without really being noticed, you will not like our church, because it is a culture of connection and hospitality. Our race or ethnicity is a culture. Often white people don't recognize that they have certain cultural norms, just as do African Americans or Asians and Asian Americans, Native Americans. Every racial ethnic group has a certain culture, and in fact, multiple cultures. We have an Ethiopian congregation who worships in our church building. Well, they actually come from different parts of Ethiopia with different languages. They share the major language of Ethiopia, Amharic, but they also have different cultures within that one country. And so, again, what is the culture within the culture that you inhabit? Geographical context creates different cultures. Languages, as we've said, are a basis of different cultural groupings. But it's important for us to remember that there are many cultures we don't necessarily think about, and we may or may not know anything about. There is an LGBTQ culture. Many of us are aware of it, but a lot of people who haven't spent time in the culture or speaking with those who belong to that culture have great misunderstandings about it. You will see something and assume this is part of the culture, when it might not be. For most of the people, that's not what they consider a behavior that is really culturally standard. There is such a thing as deaf culture, American Sign Language. So often in communities of people with disabling conditions, they will be treated as not fully human. Someone is in a wheelchair in a restaurant, and the server asks the able-bodied person, what will he have? And he says, I'm perfectly able of answering you. So there are cultural understandings that exist there. In socioeconomic groupings, there are cultural norms at work. What does it mean to be poor? It may mean that you share more with one another, that is a value. If you are in a upper socioeconomic class, then the foundation that you have, there are certain standards and understandings about what would be appropriate behavior. All of this is to say, it probably would make sense to sit down and think about for a while all the cultures that you are a part of, all the cultures that you move in and out of in your daily lives and in your world. And then also think about the cultures you don't know very much about. You might have some misunderstandings about those other cultures, not intentionally, but because you really haven't learned about them. And this is part of what, again, we hope to accomplish in this course, is opening ourselves to learn more about those cultures that we really don't know or understand. When we do that, we will build bridges, which is something that God calls all of us to do. As we begin to think about other cultures and learning about them, one of the things that's very important to understand is that cultures are often compared to icebergs. You can see the tip of the iceberg, that extends out of the water. You can see what's on the surface. But so much of the culture is not immediately obvious, not observable without some care and attention. So what does this mean? Well, think about when you look at, say, an ethnic group. You may notice the language. You may notice physical differences. You may notice the foods that they eat. You may notice the clothes that they wear. Now, these are all cultural characteristics. But the harder part of a culture is probably more important. You don't really need to understand the foods they eat. If they invite you to eat, sure, you should try them and see what the typical food might be. But the real key to understanding a culture are these deeper qualities and characteristics, such as how do they deal with conflict? Some people groups will take on conflict head on. Others will sidestep conflict. How do they express anger? How do they express grief? How do they express joy or gratitude or respect? There are very different ways that cultures express these kinds of values. And if we don't understand that, we think, oh, that person is looking at the ground, they're being disrespectful, when in fact in their culture it might be the deepest way of showing respect. Again, part of the journey in cultural competence is to find ways that we are able to go deeper and understand those things that are not immediately obvious to the eye. The church has different cultures at work. The United Methodist Church has a different culture than Presbyterians have, for example. And different individual local congregations will have different cultures at work, depending upon race and ethnicity, depending on the language used in worship, depending upon the part of the country or world that the church is located in. We have to recognize and understand clearly that the culture that we are most comfortable in is only one way of living. It's only one way of worshiping God. It's only one way of being human as God has created us to be. Sometimes we fall into the mindset that our culture is superior, and we need to be very careful about that. There are different ways of living, but they are often beloved of God and created by God. Sure, there are some things. There's a drug culture that we would not say is a wonderful thing. But if we want to be in ministry to those who have addictive behaviors, we might need to understand that culture in order to be able to break cycles of addiction. We might not say that homeless culture is a wonderful culture, but to work with the homeless and to break those cycles, we probably need to understand that culture deeply. So rather than imposing our culture upon anyone else, it is so important in our ministries to begin with the idea of what do I need to know about the other person's cultures? How do I build relationships across those cultures so I can best represent Christ in the world? And so the final question we might want to ask right now is, what does it mean to you that God created in diversity? Remember that as Christians, we often say, I love everyone. I don't see color, or I don't see physical differences, and yet God created us in all this diversity. How do we embrace, appreciate, learn to negotiate this variety of cultural difference? In fact, if you think about many of the conflicts in the larger church and our local congregations, they're based upon certain differences in thinking, in perspective, and we might all be better able to function together, to love and be loved, if we were able to understand the differences that are at work, and rather than just rejecting them outright, at least being able to appreciate where the other person is coming from. So what does it mean to you that God created such diversity? I invite you to take a look at these two additional resources. The first is a reading that gives you some deeper information about culture. The second you will really enjoy is a video on YouTube about culture. I warn you, she talks really fast. And secondly, there are some sociological terms, see, a language, that she uses that aren't really so important for us, but will help to explain and understand what we mean by culture